Welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast, your ticket to all things college football. Are you looking to get your college football fix? Looking to get the latest news on your favorite school's team? Join us as we talk college football from the national championship to college rivalries to bowl games to the Heisman Trophy to which conference is the best. We've got you covered for the Big Ten, SEC, Big 12, Pac-12, ACC, and everything in between.
Thanks for tuning in to the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jessica Kofi, and lately there has been a lot of talk surrounding fans and the college stadiums that they fill, and whether or not once the fall arrives, we'll still see that as a reality in college football. And that discussion comes about, especially right now, for a good reason. Not only is the NFL draft season underway, and a lot of the post-draft workouts and team meetups are canceled, but this discussion is on people's minds for a really good reason. One of the biggest draws into college football and why we're so addicted to this level of sport is because of the electric atmosphere, and there are so many difficult environments that really are challenges for visiting teams across the country. And of course we know any road game is difficult, but when you go to certain stadiums, they seem like winning in that building can become impossible. And there are so many reasons for that. Crowd size is one of them. And traditions can also play a factor, but we also have to trust what we see. And especially in recent years, there's been a lot of success surrounding teams that are playing at home. So in this episode, we're going to take a little bit of a closer look at the 10 most hostile college stadium environments to go into as a visiting team in college football. So in the first segment, we're going to take a look at numbers 10 and 9. And coming in at number 10 is a school that probably isn't on most people's radars. And that's because they're a group of 5 program, but they definitely are well known to college fans and even casual college football fans. And that team is Boise State, and they play at Albertson Stadium, but arguably no group of 5 program has had more success over the past decade or so than the Broncos of Boise State. They might not have the most appealing facility for players or the most flashy program for fans who want to watch, but they do have a super strong fan base. And that is part of what makes their stadium such a hard place to play in as a visitor. And they really pride themselves on that home field advantage that they've created, because really, where else can you find blue turf? That's such a notable way to stick out. And in Boise, Idaho, Albertson Stadium is probably one of the most recognizable and most famous playing fields, not even just in college football or in football, but in sports. Whenever you see a highlight and you see that blue turf, you automatically are paying attention, and you automatically know that, oh, that's that football team that has the blue turf. And that's what makes it so iconic as a venue, especially over the last 16 or so seasons, when Boise State has gone an impressive 92-8 on their home field. And that includes a perfect 7-0 record in their conference, the Mountain West Conference, and their championship victory over Hawaii last season. So a little bit of a background on their stadium. It opened back in 1970, and it did not originally have the infamous blue playing surface that we're used to seeing today. And originally it was named Bronco Stadium, but that 10,000 seat stadium was replaced with a new stadium in the same location. And in the 1970 season, they played their first game at that stadium against Chico State, and it was in front of a sellout crowd in a stadium that now held over 14,500 people. So since they opened back in 1970, there have been several more expansions and additions completed. The upper deck was added on the east side of the stadium in 1974, and that increased the amount of seating to 20,000. And then they underwent a $10 million renovation project in 1997, which added more seats on the southern side of the stadiums, and that increased the capacity to 30,000. And not to mention that they added in their own Boise State Broncos Hall of Fame as part of the project. So fast forward to the start of the 2008 season, a new 3-story structure was added on the west side, which included a new press box, club and luxury seats and suites, and that added 2,000 more seats to the total capacity of the stadium. So that brings us to the famous blue turf, and that was the idea of the athletic director at the time, Gene Blameyer. So his idea was, instead of spending another almost $1 million on traditional green turf, why not make the surface blue, and it would stand out and attract attention to Boise State football program. And as we know now, that idea was brilliant and it worked. And now they're known throughout the sports world for their playing field. So in May of 2014, the stadium underwent its most recent change, and that was to the name, and it became Albertson Stadium after Albertsons LLC purchased the naming rights for the next 15 years. So not only is the new Albertson Stadium home of the Broncos, but they also host the annual famous Idaho Potato Bowl. And compared to a lot of other stadiums in the country, their capacity could be seen as tiny because it now stands at just over 36,000 seats. But the Broncos have made Albertsons easily Mountain West's toughest venue and one of the most hostile in the nation, not to mention one of the most famous. That brings us to number 9 on their list. And number 9 belongs to the UCF Knights and Spectrum Stadium. Because although they don't play in front of the biggest crowd, just like Boise State, their fans have definitely put in the work to put them on the map and make their stadium one of the toughest road venues in the country to play in. It's nicknamed the Bounce House, and more on that later as to why. But Spectrum Stadium in Orlando has turned into one of the toughest places to play during the last couple of seasons, because we've watched UCF have this unprecedented rise to prominence as the team to beat amongst the group of 5 power colleges. And over the last 3 seasons, they haven't lost a game in that stadium, winning 21 straight. And that includes during the 2017 season, which played out like a dream for them under head coach Scott Frost. And as college football fans are aware, they pulled off a perfect 13-0 season and capped it off with a 7-point win over Auburn in the Peach Bowl. Although, infamously, they weren't even close to being selected for a college football playoff spot, even though they were the only undefeated team of the season. But going back to their stadium, the majority of D1 teams that we see have stadiums that are more than 50 years old. You know, they're very storied, historic, are steeped in tradition, and that's where the attachment with the fans comes from. But on the opposite side of that is UCF, and the Knights have one of the newest stadiums in college football. The history of their team goes back to 1979, when they were a D3 football program, and they played at the Citrus Bowl. Then they moved to do D1 in 1996, and today they're in the AAC, the American Athletic Conference. But they needed to obviously bring their stadium up to match their newfound standing as a Division I university. Obviously, that is the main way colleges are able to compete with one another. Facilities is a huge part of that. So in 2005, UCF proposed building a new stadium closer to their campus. It was originally scheduled to open in 2006, but there were delays to construction, mainly because of protests from a nearby neighborhood. But for the 2007 season, in September of that year, they played their first game at their new stadium, and they hosted the Texas Longhorns. So it's still not one of the biggest ones. As you can see, there's only 45,000 seats, and in the college football world, we know that's not that much, but that doesn't mean that the stadium can't still be impressive, because they do boast quite a few features that are impressive for a stadium that size, like a 4-story tower that they call the Roth Tower that contains their press box. They have 24 luxury suites on top of over 820 club seats. But the stadium was designed with an expansion in mind in the future to be able to accommodate up to 65,000 seats. And once their former owner, Bright House, was purchased in April 2017, the stadium was renamed to Spectrum Stadium, and essentially the transformation that's brought them up to the Division I standard that they're at now was completed. So for now, they only hold about 45,000 people, but the student section is what gives it the energy that has an impact on opponents. And they've managed to stay successful in the last few years, even though they have racked up a loss here and there since their perfect season. And students have definitely continued to rally around their program and advocate for their players, who they know are putting everything in when they hit the turf every Saturday afternoon. And the home of the Knights has been nicknamed the Bounce House, as I mentioned earlier. It's also called the Trampoline, because the stands have the ability to bounce back and forth and rock when the song Current Craft comes on in the stadium. So as a Group of 5 squad, they may never get a real shot at the college football playoff, barring a significant expansion or change to the formula of the selections. But the UCF Knights and their crown will always make it difficult for visitors to get wins in their territory. And that brings us to our first break. But when we come back, we're going to reveal who our number is 8 and 7 on this list.
You really can't underestimate the importance of having the right creative work for your brand or your product. Whether it's a logo, a website, a book cover, or an ad campaign, you really need a quality design to make that big difference pop and deliver your overall engagement and success in a competitive market. That's where Design Crowd comes in. Design Crowd has over 750,000 designers from Sydney to San Francisco ready to help you with awesome creative ideas. They make crowdsourcing work for you. So if you need a logo or you're working on your creative branding, you can go to designcrowd.com and post a brief describing the design you need. And then within about 2 to 7 days, you'll receive up to over 100 different designs from designers around the world. Then you pick the best design and approve payment to the designer. So you're only paying for the design that you want. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of freelancing and out of crowdsourcing. And you don't have to be a huge company like Harvard Business School to use Design Crowd, although they have used it as well. You can start a project on Design Crowd for as little as $99. And if you go right now to designcrowd.com/health and wellness or enter the promo code health and wellness on their website, then our health and wellness listeners will receive up to $150 off of your design project. That's designcrowd.com/health and wellness or entering that promo code health and wellness.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines. They got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the College Football Podcast. And in the first segment, we covered Boise State and the University of Central Florida, who are numbers 10 and 9 on this list of hardest and most hostile college football stadiums to go into as a visitor. And in this segment, we're going to keep going down the list and touch on numbers 8 and 7. So coming in at number 8 is Georgia, and their Dooley Field at Sanford Stadium is home to the Bulldogs. But fans from around the world know it as something else and are familiar with it as something other than a football stadium. And that's because Sanford Stadium played host to the 1996 Olympics for the medal round of the finals in soccer, and over 3 billion people worldwide watched that medal presentation. So it's recognizable for other reasons, but for the Bulldogs fans who are passionate about their football in Athens, Georgia, and even casual football fans who keep track of SEC games or any of the top teams in college, it's also home to one of the most exciting stadiums in football that you can watch. And here's where we start to see stadiums that have a higher capacity as opposed to the ones that were touched on in segment 1, because Dooley Field is able to hold over 92,000, almost 93,000 people when it's filled to capacity for every game. And it's also one of the largest on-campus stadiums in the country. So it makes sense as to why it's comforting for home fans and absolutely terrifying for everybody else that's trying to come in and face them, especially if you're experiencing that for the first time. And they're one of the SEC's best team. That's no secret that Georgia is right up there. Because of that fact, not only is the size of the stadium and the size of the crowd intimidating, but just knowing you're heading into play, Georgia has helped make it one of the most unwelcoming environments in the country, especially over the last 3 years, since the Bulldogs have only lost one game at home, and that was from last season's heartbreaking upset against South Carolina that obviously Georgia fans didn't see coming. But they've been very consistent between the hedges, as they like to say, and that's allowed them to compete for conference and national titles and have the pleasure of playing some of them on their own home field. So a little background on how their stadium managed to get to the status that it holds today, and that ties in a lot to the deep ingrained history of football in Georgia and how big of a part it's been for the university itself. It dates back to 1892 at UGA when the team played what was then called Hurdy Field. And in 1911, the university president at the time moved their games from Hurdy Field to a more centralized location on campus, and that was named after himself, Stanford Field. So fast forward to the 1920s, and their rivalry with Georgia Tech actually led to a new stadium being constructed for the team. And these rival games were usually played at Georgia Tech's home field, Grant Field, because the field that Georgia had at the time, Stanford Field, simply just wasn't large enough. And they wanted a stadium that would rival their rival's stadium. And they began to raise money for construction, led by the president, Dr. Stanford, at the time. And the stadium was finally opened in October of 1929 after $360,000 had been spent. And they played their first game against Yale in front of 30,000 people. So that was when they officially had enough of a significant stadium in order to host the big games against opponents that they needed to play. But perhaps now the landmarks of the stadium and the trademarks that are the most recognizable are the infamous hedges surrounding the field, and obviously their mascot, Ugga, the white bulldog, who they've had 5 or now going on 6 editions. But those two traditions are so tied together that even the former, now deceased Uggas are interred in a mausoleum that's inside Stanford Stadium and at the southwest corner of it. And just to touch on something that was mentioned a little bit before, between the hedges refers to the hedges that enclose Sanford Field and have been there since the stadium opened in 1929 and that's why they usually refer to their games that way. But all of that just goes to show how much of Georgia's tradition and pride in their team is also directly ingrained in the stadium and the atmosphere that they play in. Not only that, it gives them an enormous home field advantage, and that advantage has come in handy over the last few years, but has not been cheap. And it's estimated that over $71 million has been put into expanding the stadium into what it is today. And those include 6 major expansions over the years that occurred in 1949, 1964, 67, 81, 91, and 2003. And those expansions were basically just to enclose the stadium, add an upper deck for more seating, and also luxury suites. But the latest addition to the stadium was added before the 2011 season, and that was to put in a new HD video scoreboard. And those improvements are definitely worth the price over the years, and they've definitely paid for themselves since Sanford Stadium has finished in the top 7 in attendance in 21 of the last 24 years. And since Georgia has only continued to perform better over the last few years, and their schedule is constantly filled with national contenders because of it, these attendance figures are only going to continue growing. They've shown no sign of letting up once stadiums are safe to be reopened. And once that happens, you can guarantee that Sanford Stadium is going to pack in its capacity over 92,000 people. And for whoever comes in to face Georgia, especially at first, that's going to be an overwhelming sight for teams to see, especially if it's a smaller school. And the stadium's layouts don't put all these fans piled up on top of the field like some other stadiums are designed to, but they still get plenty loud, and you probably wouldn't need any type of enhancement technology in order to be intimidated by Georgia's crowd. Because when 92,000 people strong are bearing down on you and are going nuts and are absolutely loud, and it's tough for opposing quarterbacks especially to hear at the line of scrimmage and to hear plays being called. And you can see opposing teams noticeably being a little bit rattled. So Georgia may not have a lot of tough opponents, especially on its 2020 schedule, but one matchup we'll definitely be looking forward to seeing, if all is able to go forward as planned for this fall, is a showdown with the Auburn Tigers. And that's going to be a difficult matchup for both sides, but with Georgia's advantage and their home field behind them, there's no doubt that they have what it takes to win. Next on the list comes Oklahoma, and Gaylor Family Oklahoma Memorial Stadium is a building that the Sooners haven't lost a step in under Lincoln Riley since he came in after 2017, and because of that, the fans continue to pack into that stadium, and it's easily the Big 12's hardest building to play in. Under Lincoln Riley, they've gone 18-1, and that one loss came only to the Iowa State Cyclones back in 2017. And their only other loss at home since 2015 came against a number 3 ranked Ohio State in 2016, when they kind of got blown out at home 45-24. But despite all of that, it's really hard to beat the Sooners when they're at home. And even though Red River rivalry games against Texas are always played on a neutral ground and don't necessarily count as home wins, all of that home field advantage energy has helped Oklahoma take 5 consecutive Big 12 titles. And they've even used that momentum to push them into the college football playoffs from time to time. But a little history on Memorial Stadium, which dates back to the early 1920s. And it basically started when a group of students formed a committee to try to get a new stadium built for the Sooners, and the coach at the time, Benny Owen, helped secure a lot of the funding that they needed. And by 1921, construction had begun on a new facility for Oklahoma. So it took 2 years to finish up, and it was named in honor of university personnel who had passed away in World War I. And the field was also named in honor of the coach, Benny Owen, who helped get started. So fast forward to October of 1923, Oklahoma is playing their first home game in that stadium against Washington, which originally held 16,000 seats on only one side of the field, only the west side of the field. But as support for the team grew, so did the stadium, and they needed to keep up with the rising attention that they were getting. So in 1929, an additional 16,000 seats were added on the east side of the stadium. And by 1949, the playing field was lowered a little bit and the running track was removed in order to make it a serious football-only stadium. So now seating was allowed to be added along the field in the north side of the end zone, and that increased the capacity to 55,000. So that made quite a jump from the 32,000 that it was at before. In the 1950s, they continued to expand, and that's when the south end zone bleachers were put in, and that brought capacity up to over 61,000, almost 62,000 seats. So just like a lot of other teams in the 1960s and 70s, they then replaced the grass with AstroTurf before they kicked off the 1970 season. And the upper deck on the west side and the press box were added 5 years later, which brought seating up to 70,000 total. Now, by 1980, the temporary bleachers that were put at the south end zone were removed and they were put in with permanent ones, which was probably for the best because they had been there for about 23 years, and that's probably way too long to be sitting on temporary bleachers. But this is what finally gave Memorial Stadium a capacity of 75,000, and here you see them start to move into the class of top tier, not just college football teams, but college football facilities. And the artificial surface was removed before the 94 season, and it was replaced with natural grass again. But in 1995, they put in 9 more suites and added in the video scoreboard along with some lights. And finally, there was a large renovation project that took place before the 2002 season, which added in an upper deck and 8,000 more seats, as well as 27 luxury suites. In addition to the outside of the stadium also being upgraded to match the look of how the Oklahoma campus developed. But lately, they haven't been making as many upgrades to the number of seats, but most of the stadium upgrades lately have been to enhance the fan experience and what it's like during game day at Oklahoma games. And most notably, they've added in a massive new scoreboard, which is probably, if not the largest, then one of the largest in college sports. And it's just one part of a multi-year, $160 million project that's eventually gonna include a lot of revamps to multiple parts of the stadium. But for right now, the stadium is held at 84,000 seats, and it's home to so many legendary teams that have gone through Oklahoma, and the Sooners have seen 7 national titles and 45 conference championships while playing in that building. But as for the Big 12 as a whole, they've had to face that Oklahoma crowd over and over again, and they've had very little success with taking down the Sooners on their own territory. So the Sooner Schooner, which comes in to stir up the crowd, and the crowd that often responds with Boomer Sooners and the Way Too Deep chant, they're part of what gets the players going. And the tradition of constant prosperity and good wins and good years at Oklahoma in general, on top of a fresh, new, young head coach and the massive crowds that they play in front of, have made Gaylord Family Oklahoma Memorial Stadium one of college football's toughest places to visit, especially if you're coming from in-conference. And that brings us to our second break, but when we come back, numbers 6 and 5 are next up.
I want to talk to you guys about this amazing product I've been using lately called Hydrant. If you're like me and you want to kick the coffee habit, but you're worried about your energy levels depleting, to avoid the morning sluggishness and that midday slump, you need to make sure you're hydrated. It's super important. And that's where I've been using Hydrant. And for 25% off your first order, you can go to drinkhydrant.com and enter promo code GSMC at checkout. Hydrant is basically flavored electrolyte packets you mix directly into your water to make hydrating your body easy and delicious. And what I love about Hydrant, it's backed by research. The formula was developed by Oxford scientists to provide perfectly balanced, efficient hydration. Again, that's drinkhydrant.com and enter promo code GSMC for 25% off your first order. Another really cool thing about Hydrant, there's no synthetic colors or artificial sweeteners. The formula is vegan and you can choose between 3 different flavors or a variety pack. So for all my vegan friendly fellows out there, this one's for you. Again, this is drinkhydrant.com and enter promo code GSMC.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the College Football Podcast. And in the last segments, we touched on numbers 8 and 7, Georgia and Oklahoma, and the countdown of the most difficult college football stadiums to play in. And in this segment, we're going to get started with numbers 6 and 5. And coming in at number 6 is Michigan. And there's only one word that really describes Michigan Stadium, and that word is humongous. And from the time it opened back in 1927 until now, it's maintained the same status of being one of the largest and officially the largest stadium, not just in college football, but in America in general. And the Wolverines have had the biggest sports stadium with over 107,000 seats to fill on Saturday afternoons. And that definitely creates a home field advantage for the Wolverines. But the inability for them in recent years to perform in big games, especially the game against Ohio State, it makes it hard to put this stadium higher on this list. But despite their overall struggles under Jim Harbaugh as of late in the last few years, they've regularly protected what they call the big house in games that they need to. But before the big house was the big house that we know of today, Michigan used to play at Ferry Field since 1906, and they continually had to expand that stadium as interest in the team grew. And with all of that growing support, a new stadium ended up being needed to accommodate all the fans that wanted to come and watch them play in person. So the coach of the team at the time, Fielding Yost, designed a new stadium himself, and the university approved the construction in April of 1926. So when they started to plan out their stadium, they modeled it after the Yale Bowl, and it was built of steel and concrete. And by the time it was completed, it cost over $950,000 to build and sat nearly 72,000 fans. So it was also designed with expansion in mind in the future, and it was designed to seat up to 200,000 fans. Which, thinking of how massive it is today, the fact that they were picturing back in the 1920s, 100 years ago, of seating up to 200,000 fans is not only crazy to think of, it's also incredible foresight. And even before it opened in 1927, he was lobbying the university to add even more seats, and he wanted an additional 10,000 seats added to the stadium. But it was approved as was, and it was completed in 1927, and they played their first game in October against Ohio Wesleyan. And the entire single-tier circle around the playing field sat 84,401 people officially when it opened. And even now, that's larger than most stadiums that we see. And during this time, it was an enormous number of people. And it was by far the largest stadium in the nation. But as the team grew more support, even past this, the stadium also had to continue to grow. And by 1928, the capacity was increased again to just under 86,000. But by 1930, they were making more improvements, and new electric scoreboards were added to each end zone, and they expanded again within the next 20 years. And by the 1949 season, the stadium could now hold over 97,000 fans. But they weren't then done there yet, and in 1956, a new press box was added, and that increased the capacity to over 100,000 for the first time to just over 101,000. And then they added in the infamous blue bleachers and the yellow block M, and those were completed right before the 1965 season kicked off. But before the 1969 season, the grass was replaced with a type of AstroTurf, as was very popular back then. But before the start of the 91 season, the field had to be lowered, and the installment of natural grass and 2 more rows of seats were being put in, and that boosted the capacity, as well as the fact that they removed 3 rows of box seats that were located in the front of the stadium and replaced them with bleacher seats to bring capacity up to 102,501. So there were additional renovations on top of those that were completed in 97 and in 98, which brought the capacity up to 107,501. And more recently, they've gone back and replaced the grass field again with field turf. They've done a lot of renovations in more recent years since the turn of the century as well. And by 2010, there were over 109,000 seats. But fast forward to the start of the 2015 season, and they had to reduce the stadium's capacity by 2,300 seats to where it currently stands at 107,601 seats due to a reconfiguring of the stadium for non-football events and the installation of handrails throughout the stadium. So it peaked at over 109,000, and now peak capacity sits at just over 107,600. But although their stadium also doesn't trap sound like other venues, the crowd still knows how to get loud and get hype. And if you're going to a Michigan home game, you're usually going to watch the home team get a victory. So even if you have no attachment to the program, it's difficult not to have goosebumps when you're watching over 100,000 people pile into a building and start to yell as their team races onto the field and touch the Go Blue banner, and it's just one of the quintessential experiences in college football. And that brings us to number 5 on the list, and that's Memorial Stadium, which is home to the most exciting 25 seconds in college football, which is what they call when Clemson Tigers players exit buses and race down the hill after touching their legendary Howard's Rock. And it's one of the best traditions in college football. And watching the Clemson players' ritual, it gives you goosebumps if you're wearing that bright orange on game day, or even if you're not wearing bright orange on game day. And if you pair that with the fact that the Tigers rarely lose at home on Saturdays now in the last few years, it's quite intimidating for opposing players to come in and want to face up against that. And the legend that is Clemson grew when the first meeting of father and son coaches, aka Bolden Bowl 1, took place in front of a record crowd of over 86,000 fans back in 1999. And they finished in the top 20 in the country in average home attendance for 39 seasons. So not even since then, but going back almost 40 straight years. Recently, the new edition of the Tigers have built on the legacy that was put in place for them. And they've been an elite program since Dabo Swinney took over 12 years ago. But most importantly to their success have been the fans. And they've been some of the loudest fans in the country for way longer than Dabo Swinney's tenure there. They've been led by quarterbacks like Deshaun Watson and now Trevor Lawrence, and have gone 34-1 at home in what they like to call Death Valley over the last 5 years. So they only further enhanced that with last season when they recorded a perfect 7-0 home record on the season for the third straight year in a row. And that also extended their home win streak to a school record 22 games, but also ranked them 14th in the nation and first in the ACC in average home attendance. So all of that success, needless to say, has helped Clemson go to the last 5 college football playoffs and win 2 national titles in that span. Since the advent of the college football playoff in 2014, they've only lost once at home and have won 41 out of 42 games. So that is not just impressive, but it's also the highest home winning percentage in the country. So it's no surprise that visiting a team like that, and when they're a defending national champion on top of that, most people wouldn't expect you to be performing at your best. And that's probably why teams that are facing the defending national champion are 0-3 all-time at Memorial Stadium. So that stadium has definitely been good to the Tigers. But it wasn't always loved by everybody associated with the university. It was actually constructed against the advice of at least one coach at the time, and that's Coach Justin Neely. And right before he left for Rice after the 1939 season, he gave Clemson a message saying not to ever let them talk you into building a big stadium. Put about 10,000 seats behind the YMCA, and that's all you'll ever need. So clearly Clemson didn't follow Neely's advice, and the officials decided to build the new stadium in a valley on the western part of campus. And good thing that they didn't listen. And it took a lot of clearing, and crews went to work, cutting, pouring, forming everything that they needed to get this stadium underway. And by September of 1942, Memorial Stadium opened, and Clemson beat Presbyterian College 32-13 in their first matchup. And at the time, they could only hold 20,000 fans, but after that opener, that stadium would quickly start growing. And the original part of the stadium was built in the early 1940s. And most of the work on the stadium has actually been done by scholarship athletes, including the football players who have played in the building themselves. And more specifically, 2 members of the football team named A.N. Cameron and Hugh Webb. But with all that being said, the construction didn't go without its share of problems. And one afternoon during the construction, when they were clearing some land still, a young player announced that he wasn't allergic to poison oak and was kind of boasting about it, and then proceeded to attack the poison oak with a swing blade and threw the plants all about. And the next day, the boy was swollen to twice his size and had to be hospitalized. And as silly as that story may be, it's not the only one. It's even said that they were so far behind in building the stadium that on the first game that they were supposed to play, they hung up the gates at 1 p.m. and they started the game just an hour later. But luckily for them, that would be all the construction for a while. And through the years, Memorial Stadium has become to be known as Death Valley for good reason across the country. It was nicknamed that in the late 1940s after an opposing head coach who kept getting whipped in that stadium pretty much. And the term Death Valley pretty much just stuck from there. So now that it holds over 81,000 fans, the crowd is ready to go even before games kick off, thanks to all of the tradition and pageantry that surround even just the entrance to the stadium at Howard's Rock and running down the hill. But to be fair, it's hard not to be fired up even more once you're in the stadium and Enter Sandman starts playing And they might not have as big of a stadium as, say, Michigan or Alabama, but they do have one of the loudest fan bases in the history of college football. And their recent success that helps make Death Valley one of the country's toughest stadiums to play in. That brings us to our next break, but when we come back, the countdown enters the top 4.
You really can't underestimate the importance of having the right creative work for your brand or your product. Whether it's a logo, a website, a book cover, or an ad campaign, you really need a quality design to make that big difference pop and deliver your overall engagement and success in a competitive market. That's where Design Crowd comes in. Design Crowd has over 750,000 designers from Sydney to San Francisco ready to help you with awesome creative ideas. They make crowdsourcing work for you. So if you need a logo or you're working on your creative branding, you can go to designcrowd.com and post a brief describing the design you need. And then within about 2 to 7 days, you'll receive up to over 100 different designs from designers around the world. Then you pick the best design and approve payment to the designer. So you're only paying for the design that you want. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of freelancing and out of crowdsourcing. And you don't have to be a huge company like Harvard Business School to use Design Crowd, although they have used it as well. You can start a project on Design Crowd for as little as $99. And if you go right now to designcrowd.com/health and wellness or enter the promo code health and wellness on their website, then our health and wellness listeners will receive up to $150 off of your design project. That's designcrowd.com/health and wellness or entering that promo code health and wellness.
Are you looking for help for your fantasy football team? Check out the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. Get today's best advice on who to start, who to sit, even who you should draft. From sleeper picks to red hot lineups, they got it all covered for you. That's GSMCpodcast.com/fantasy-football-podcast. We'll cover traditional leagues, dynasty, PPR, even IDP leagues. When you need fantasy help, there's just one show to hit up. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the College Football Podcast. And before the break, we covered the first 6 teams that have the most intimidating stadiums to play in as a visitor. And that brings us in this segment to picks number 4 and 3. And coming in at 4 is Penn State. And while Beaver Stadium might be welcome to Happy Valley for Penn State fans, it's anything but if you're an opposing team. Because each Saturday during the fall in State College, it becomes a mecca of college football when Penn State is playing at home. And they've been home to the Nittany Lions for over 4 decades now. It's one of the largest stadiums in college football, coming in the top 3. And the original version of the stadium was played in for about 50 years, from 1909 to 1959. But throughout the past century, Nittany Lions have been playing at several facilities, including the original Beaver Stadium, which was located on the west side of their campus and held up to 30,000 fans at once. But the university decided to disassemble that stadium and move it to its current location after 50 years. And the team played its first game in the rebuilt stadium in September of 1960 against Boston University. But Beaver Stadium's horseshoe shape let it have a seating capacity of over 46,000. And since then, they've built many expansions onto their relocated stadium, the first of which was completed in 1969 when they increased the seating by 2,000, and several of those additions came during and after the 70s, which increased the capacity to up to 76,000, especially after the track was removed from the stadium and it was cut into sections and raised so that they could add in new seats where the track was once located. 2 years after that renovation, in 1981, the capacity stood at almost 84,000, and the next large renovation project came about 10 years later in 91 when they increased the capacity by another 10,000. So most of how and why they're able to do this is because of the continued fan support that Penn State has seen expand and grow over the years that they've built their legacy. And that led to the massive renovation that they underwent right after the turn of the century. And that added not just 10,000 seats and an upper deck, but also a new video board, scoreboard, 60 luxury suites, 4,000 club seats, and new concessions and restrooms. So it wasn't even just about just being able to squeeze more people into the stadium, but it's also about improving the game day experience for the fans while they were there. And today, it's currently standing right behind Michigan State with 107,000 capacity seating. And because of its size, it's definitely one of the scariest places for opposing teams to come into. So even if they weren't a top team in the Big Ten and they don't come close to winning a title in 2020, they'll still have one of the conference's toughest home crowds to play in front of, assuming things are going to get back to normal at some point where they can have fans in attendance. And once that happens, there are a few scenes that we will probably be more excited to witness than a traditional whiteout game at PSU. So with all of that being said, their success is due just as much to the fans getting crazy in their stands as it is to the overall size of Beaver Stadium in general. And that is kind of proven by their record last season at home, where they went undefeated with a perfect 7-0 record, and they actually haven't even lost a home game in 3 of the last 4 seasons. So they'll host some tough Big Ten opponents this season, such as Ohio State, Iowa, but their fans give them an edge, and hopefully that can help them pull off wins in some, if not all, of those contests. And if that's the case, they might even be able to sneak into the CFP next year. And now for number 3 on this list, and this should come as no surprise. Number 3 belongs to Bryant-Denny Stadium in Alabama, and the reason why is pretty obvious, because once you start to picture a crowd that's roaring with over 100,000, nearly 102,000 fans, and they're all chanting, "Roll Tide, roll it at you," then you know you're at the home of the Crimson Tide. And they've inhabited that stadium since 1929, another one of the schools that have a long attachment to the stadium they play in. And in that time, they've seen 16 national championships come through, the teams that have played at Bryant-Denny. And it's not just the stadium itself that makes it one of the worst atmospheres for opponents to play in, but it's also the game day experience and the stuff that the fans love the most. It's the recording of former legendary head coach Bear Bryant's voice that's broadcast throughout the stadium. It's also the $1 Million Band of over 400 members, and they truly sound like they're playing like $1 million. And when they're leading the Alabama fight song, they can't help but show their team spirit in the loudest way possible. And even in the final minute of a game, there's no question that the fans are just as engaged as they were in the beginning, when you're hearing Rammer Jammer Cheer play through the stadium. And as a visitor coming in, all of that combined just has to feel so demoralizing. And you can't blame the opposing players for feeling that way, especially since today it stands as the 5th largest stadium in the country. Even though it didn't start out that way, it definitely took a lot of hard work to get the stadium to where it is, and there were 7 expansions along the way. And even though Alabama has been playing football for over a whole century, it took almost 4 decades before they began to play at their current stadium, because before Bryant-Denny was open, they played at Denny Field and University Field. But by the mid-1920s, they decided it was time for their own football facility, and a new one at that, and they built a 12,000-seat stadium to start. Originally, it was known as the George Hutchinson Denny Stadium, and they started to play in their new home in September of 1929. So, like every other team on this list, they had to begin expanding their stadium due to fan support, and that started in 1937. And by the time the 1966 season hit, capacity had already grown to fit 60,000 fans. Then came the official name change in 1975, which was brought on by an Alabama state legislature. So if that doesn't point to how important this is to the entire state, then what would? And it went from George Hutchinson Denny Stadium to Bryant-Denny Stadium after the legendary head coach Paul Bear Bryant. But the growth of the stadium and Alabama legend didn't stop there. And throughout the 90s, as demands for tickets to Crimson Tide games increased, so did the size of what was now known as Bryant-Denny. Even before the 2006 season, they put in a $50 million expansion project, and that's what brought the seating capacity to over 92,000 seats, and added in skyboxes, but probably most notably a grand promenade was constructed to connect the stadium to the main University Boulevard, and that's what created the area that's known as the Walk of Champions, which is lined with these large statues of the 4 head coaches who have brought Alabama to national championship. But also on that Walk of Champions are granite tablets that commemorate the school's 29 conference championships as well as the 16 national championships. So fast forward to the latest renovation on the stadium, which was announced back in August of 2018, and it's a multi-phase project that is still being put into effect, and it was initially supposed to be completed in phases after this past season, including removing a large number of the seats in the south end zone and the upper deck and replacing it with a new HD video board. So that might bring the seating capacity to under 100,000, but as far as game day and Alabama goes and playing the Crimson Tide under Nick Saban, it's going to be a challenge regardless of how many seats are in the venue, or even regardless of whether or not they're playing at home. But when you have to play at Bryant-Denny Stadium in Tuscaloosa, most teams are coming in the back of their minds, they're preparing to lose, even if you would never want to admit that to yourself. Because since 2010, we've watched Alabama go 65-5, and only one of those losses has come in the last 5 years, which came at the hands of undefeated LSU last season in a very close 46-41 defeat. And we do remember quarterback at the time, Tua Tagovailoa, trying to play through a high ankle sprain, which was the injury he was battling early in the season. And that was a very unprecedented loss to Alabama fans. And that has a lot to do with head coach Nick Saban. And since he took over as head coach in 2007, he's set the bar extremely high and has nothing but high expectations for players. But he also extends that to the students who come to the games. He's been seen criticizing fans openly for not showing up for, smaller opponents or leaving blowout games early. And the school has even taken it to the next step and started to track students' locations and penalize them if they leave games early. So that is unheard of when it comes to student section, and there's probably not that much pressure put on any other student section by the head coach of their football team in the country. But when you attend Alabama, you know that's what's coming with it. And consistent success like the Crimson Tide have had, and when you see them pan out to shots of the crowd and a loud home stadium, you realize how big of a factor that is in the experience that we've come to know as Alabama games. And with still over, for now, 100,000 seats and now 17 national championships to back them up, in my opinion, they have the top 3 hardest stadiums to play in America. And that brings us to our next break. But when we come back, we're going to unveil which 2 schools came in as number 2 and number 1 on this list.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA. From the UFC to extreme cage fighting, they got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the College Football Podcast. In this episode, we've been going over the 10 hardest college football stadiums for opponents to play in. And in the first 4 segments, we've gone through numbers 10 through 3. And that brings us to number 2 on our list. And this should come as no surprise to anyone. It's Ohio State and Ohio Stadium. And the Buckeyes have dominated for the past decade or 2 under the head coaches and star players that they've had cycle through their program. And one factor that's been consistent through all of that has been the fact that they have one of the nation's biggest and largest crowds consistently. And Ohio Stadium itself is one of the most recognizable stadiums and landmarks in general in college sports. And it's also known as the Shoe because it's shaped like a horseshoe. But it was also added to the National Register of Historic Places by the National Park Service. So today it stands as definitely amongst one of the best college football stadiums in the nation. And they come in at number 3 in the country with the ability to hold almost 105,000 fans. But according to the school themselves, they've ranked no worse than 4th nationally in attendance going back to 1949. That's pretty optimistic if you ask me, but given the history of Ohio State, it's not completely out of the question. And they've definitely picked up on the fact that the mass of people that pile into their stadiums every Saturday has taken its toll on visiting teams. Since 2010, opponents have found it almost impossible to take down the Buckeyes when they're playing at home. And they've gone an incredible 67-5 over that time span, with only one of those handful of losses coming to the Sooners and their fast-flying offense in 2017, led by then quarterback Baker Mayfield, as college fans might remember. But the history of the stadium and the benefits for Ohio State dates back way further than that, all the way back to 1913, when they first played at Ohio Stadium, and it was supposed to be the stadium large enough to accommodate fans that were interested in watching the live sport, and the interest at the time was growing. So fast forward all these years to the 2014 season, and they commissioned a $9 million renovation project that was completed and expanded seating to the size that we see today. But the school did have another plan in the works that was supposed to preserve some areas of the facility and upgrade others, including a project that's meant to remove 2,600 seats and replace them with the new suite and lodge seats, and an expansion of university suites, which would have totaled a $42 million project and returned the seating capacity to just under 103,000. And it was supposed to be completed by this upcoming season. So we'll see what, if any, impact that has on Ohio State's 2020 season. All in all, the impact that the stadium helps have on the games has elevated Ohio State to a consistent college football playoff team and even secured them a national title back in 2014. So even though the acoustics aren't as conducive to keeping noise, the fans still get more than loud enough, and a crowd that large can overwhelm even the most talented and prepared opponents, especially on offense when they're trying to hear play calls or adjustments pre-snap. And the Big Ten has a lot of tough competition, but there's a reason why the Buckeyes keep winning those home games. And they have a tough upcoming slate at home this year. They'll host the Wolverines once again, and they're going to be looking to keep that rivalry at least going. And they're on a hot streak, winning over 70% of their games, 37 conference titles, and 8 national titles. So there's no doubt that Buckeye fans will continue to fill Ohio Stadium, and hopefully we'll see that stadium filled sooner rather than later. And last but certainly not least, that brings us to number 1 on the list, and it's none other than the LSU Tigers and Tiger Stadium. And every game at home begins with it's Saturday night in Death Valley, and here come your Fighting Tigers of LSU. And once you hear that, you know it's time to play ball in the Bayou in front of some of the most passionate fans in the entire sport. And they rally to over 102,000 each time they are at home. And even more impressive than that alone, on game days, Tiger Stadium becomes one of the largest cities in all of Louisiana. And like many other places in the country, LSU values football as more than just a sport. It's a way of life for them. And people in this part of the country are just as passionate about their Tigers as any other fans in any other sport. And that's why they've been called the most feared road game in the country to play at. And Death Valley is also their nickname. It doesn't just belong to Clemson, but they've also adopted the nickname for a reason. When it comes to intimidating stadiums, away teams would probably go just about anywhere else at this point in time than Tiger Stadium. And that's not even just a new thing with their recent success. It even dates back to 1988 when LSU hosted Auburn and created a human-made earthquake. And those that were there still remember it and still say that not only is it hard to forget, and not only was it like anything else, but they're just amazed that human beings could get that loud and get the ground moving to that level. But believe it or not, it's not even the only mind-blowing game that has happened at Tiger Stadium. Even a matchup with Alabama hit a noise level of 115 decibels. So Death Valley has always been a hostile venue for opponents, and 2019 just put the cherry on top. It was definitely no exception. And they went undefeated 7-0 at home, with big wins coming over Florida and Auburn, on their way to going undefeated, a national championship, all that we know that they accomplished last season. But over the last 3 campaigns, many may not pay attention to the fact that they've actually gone 18-2 at the home stadium that they've been playing in since November of 1924, when they opened Tiger Stadium against Tulane. So from the 24,000 original seated location to where it is now, over 102,000, it's now the 6th largest stadium in the country, and it's definitely by far one of the most exciting places to watch a football game, especially this year. The crowd is always loud in Baton Rouge, but things have reached an entirely new level under head coach Ed Orgeron. And his passion and the players' passion and the fans' passion consistently combine into tons of energy, even when they're just walking out into the stadium before the games. And they're just feeding off of that, and everybody in the atmosphere is feeding off of that to the point where it's reached an electric level. So even without Joe Burrow, the number 1 overall draft pick, they'll still be competitive in the SEC, and a large part of that credit goes to their stadium alone. And teams such as Alabama or Texas are going to have a hard time on the field next season and even hearing each other when they head to Baton Rouge. So between that, their overall capacity, the deafening crowd, the on-field success, that's what puts Tiger Stadium at the top of the list of college football's toughest venues. And that brings us to our last break. But when we come back, we have a list of the best of the rest stadiums in the country.
This is your ultimate stop for everything sports. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Should I say more? From the NFL, MLB, the NBA to MMA, it's all in here. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Listen now.
Welcome back to the College Football Podcast. In the first 5 segments of the podcast, we talked about the toughest college stadiums to play on the road in. And in this final segment, we're going to touch on the best of the rest stadiums in the country, because there are way more than just 10 stadiums that players and coaches alike fear to go into. And the first on this list is UCLA's Rose Bowl. And it's their home in the fall and college football's most picturesque stadium. On game days, you can view the mountains in the back, and that view can't be beat. And the stadium and the climate both combine to make this stadium a must-visit for college football fans. And it's not just the home to UCLA, but it's also the home to the most famous bowl game in the postseason that's been played for decades, the Rose Bowl. And the structure dates back to 1921. And no matter where you go in the country, you'd be hard-pressed to find any structure that's more iconic in college football than the place where Vince Young made his famous drive to win a national title against the mighty USC Trojans, or where Sam Darnold led those same Trojans to a miraculous Rose Bowl victory just 2 years ago. So the Bruins might call this one home, but the fact that it's on the national stage is what puts the Rose Bowl first on the best of the rest list. Next up is Auburn's Jordan-Hare Stadium, and Auburn puts themselves on this list because they don't want to be outdone by Alabama or any other SEC rivals. They have a lot to compete with, and so they spent almost $14 million on an upgrade to their stadium to get the largest video board in all of college football. So Alabama may have them in size, but the Tigers continually are investing in ways to improve their stadium experience instead of simply just adding more volume. And luckily for them, the walls of their stadium go straight up. So the 80,000 fans who are in attendance sound like they are 120,000 fans. And those walls going up so high make the traditional pregame flight of their live mascot, the War Eagle, even more majestic. And next is Texas A&M's Kyle Field, which in the last 5 years alone has increased capacity to nearly 103,000. And it's become home to the best student section in all of America. They call themselves the 12th Man, and they are loud, coordinated, and extremely dedicated to their Aggies. And Michigan's open bowl construction that was mentioned earlier in the episode looks surprisingly tame when you look at Kyle Field's vertically constructed walls, and that's what makes it one of the loudest stadiums in the country by design. And they spent nearly $500 million renovating back in 2014 to increase their capacity, and that is money well spent because the difference is astounding when you listen to the difference in games before the renovation and after. And it just makes not just fans, but more importantly, opponents feel like they're trapped in a cage that's just deafening to be in. And it's hard to imagine anything that could be more daunting in a venue. That brings us to Iowa's Kinnick Field, and they also have a very passionate fan base, but nothing allows them to show it off better and more often than the way their stadium is built. It holds 70,000 fans, and opponents are definitely able to feel that volume on top of them since there are thinner sidelines, but it's also towered over by a children's hospital where sick kids watch the game from the top floors, and the proximity to the hospital started one of the sweetest traditions that you'll see, which is the entire crowd turns to wave at the children at the end of the first quarter, and the children wave back. Now, with Florida's Ben Hill Griffin Stadium, the vibes aren't so welcoming and so cheery, because when fans go to visit them in Gainesville, they're usually treated to hot, sticky weather and a classic Gator chomp from the fans. And it's called the Swamp for a very good reason. The orange trim on the stadium gives the venue more of a Florida feel, and it's an iconic color combination, so you know what team you're visiting when you're there. And the 3 tiers on either end zone side make it nearly impossible to hear anything else when you reach the end zone. So don't expect an easy win if you're an opposing player stepping into the humid stadium, which is the newly minted Steve Spurrier Field. Next, there's Wisconsin, which plays at Camp Randall Stadium, and this is one of college football's most underrated stadiums because they don't really get a lot of attention, but it's not just loud, but it's also fun. And they like to do a mix of century-old stadium traditions and the new, with tens of thousands of fans jumping around. And you would think that would be a recipe for a disaster, but when you're at Wisconsin, it's just become one hell of a modern tradition. So they blast House of Pain's Jump Around, iconic party anthem, and they blare the speakers after the third quarter, and you can just feel the stadium shake with every hop of Badger fan going up and down all across the stadium. So with over 80,000 people, it still feels like an intimate environment, but people can still celebrate and every once in a while commiserate with the fans that are all around them. And lastly, this is the one iconic stadium that doesn't have many bells or whistles, but it's still just a great place to classically watch a game, and that's Notre Dame Stadium, which since 1964 has sold out every Fighting Irish game except for one, according to Notre Dame. And it was built by the legendary Knute Rockne during his coaching tenure at Indy. And it's one of the most recognizable stadiums in the nation, especially when you're talking about college football, because it's had a role in so many great American sporting moments, and not to mention iconic sporting movies, which are also based around Notre Dame as well. But to add to the folklore that is Notre Dame, no less than 7 Heisman winners have touched that "Play Like a Champion" sign above the steps leading onto the field. And you can't even forget to mention Touchdown Jesus, which is a mural that rises above one end of the field. So that paired with the fans sitting right on top of you, and you have a college football experience that's built to last generations. Thanks for listening to the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'd like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review. That really helps us. Also, please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type in GSMC to find all of our shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From football to basketball, baseball to MMA, and even soccer. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's episode of the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast.